Thank you very much for the invitation. Honored to be here in this prestigious series. And today's topic, as you can see from the heading, is instability and symmetry breaking. Why should we take an interest in instability? Well, most of us with the scientific background or social science, economics and so on, we are trained to look for stability, equilibria which are stable, because we are taught that those are the only ones that are interesting. If you have instability in a system, the equilibrium that is unstable will disappear. So we can forget about those and concentrate on the stable ones. I mean, I guess most of you are active in the areas of physiology or medicine, and of course there we have lots of examples of stable systems. Controlling body temperature, for instance, we should keep it around 37 degrees Celsius. If we depart too far from that point, we will experience problems in one way or other. And the same goes for economists. They are trained in something called general equilibrium theory, and it is tacitly understood that that equilibrium should be stable. So my aim with this lecture is to whet your appetite for instability and try to show that instability is important and actually appears in a number of different areas which may be of interest to you both in your research activities and as human beings more generally. This is the menu. I'll start with a few physical systems and then turn to a technical application, the Wright brothers' attempt to fly a little over 100 years ago. And then I'll turn to population dynamics in ecology and finish with a few examples from social systems. But first I'll make a physical experiment, and it's actually a very popular experiment among physics teachers because it always succeeds. If I place this pencil on its top like this, and if I let it go, it will fall. See, it always succeeds. Of course, this pencil is symmetric. We all know that there is an equilibrium. Theoretically, it could remain standing, but we all know from everyday experience that this pencil will fall, and the only stable equilibrium on the table here is when it's lying flat like this. By contrast, this is a device which I designed at home. One of those Christmas tree decorations, decorated also with a picture of John Locke, but I leave it to you to figure out what John Locke is doing there. Anyway, in contrast to the pencil, this system has a stable equilibrium. Okay, if I drop it and perturb it, leave it, it will return to its upright position. So we have two systems which behave very differently. This equilibrium is unstable, that's stable. That's I guess the easiest illustration you can make of the difference between stable and unstable equilibrium. Now, turning to somewhat less trivial problems. This is the spinning top that most of us played with as kids. And to the right you see a spinning top which is kept upright and is thus a symmetric system. It's rotationally symmetric as long as it keeps spinning. whereas because of friction it will lose speed and eventually it will fall and lie like this top to the left. So we see here that symmetry is lost when the energy level has fallen below a certain critical level. And that turns out to be quite a common pattern in physics. This is intended to illustrate a magnetic material. To the right, you see a magnetic material in full function, the way we experience it as when it's magnetic. Because then all those atomic magnets are kept in line, and it attracts iron objects and it attracts other magnets. That holds as long as we are below a certain temperature, but if we heat this magnet, it will eventually lose its magnetic force, and we enter the regime that we see to the left here. That critical temperature is called the Curie temperature, and that's specific to the material in question. It differs from metal to metal. But if you compare these two pictures from the symmetry point of view, you see that the left regime is more symmetric than the right one. The right-hand regime has a mirror symmetry, left-right, whereas the other is rotationally symmetric in the plane. So again, we have an example where we have a high level of symmetry at high energy levels, and we lose part of that symmetry when the energy level falls below a critical threshold. And as my third and very dramatic illustration, I ask this question which kids often ask and which physicists kept asking for many decades. Why is there anything at all out there in space? Why is there matter? And that turned out to be quite a fruitful and difficult question, which I don't have time to go into any deeper. But the problem was that in the first decades following the Second World War, theory of electromagnetism, gravity, weak and strong interaction, etc., developed rather rapidly. There was convergence on the theory called the Big Bang theory on how the universe was created. And there was also some understanding that right after its creation, this universe was symmetric. It represented a high level of symmetry. But within fractions of a second, a lot of that symmetry was lost. And a physicist of the name of Goldstone proved something called the Goldstone theorem, implying that at a high degree of symmetry, there wouldn't be any mass interaction in the electroweak forces that the physicists involved were trying to model at the time. So Goldstone's theorem was a hurdle, it was a challenge for physicists. How can we keep some level of symmetry and yet introduce matter in the universe? And the solution was proposed independently in the mid-60s, in 1964 to be precise, by a couple of teams. Robert Brout and François Englert worked together, and Peter Higgs independently. And then there was a third group who came a bit afterwards. And as you know, François Englert and Peter Higgs were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics a couple of years ago. Robert Brout had deceased by then. And their solution reminds the other examples that I've shown, namely the potential that governs the behavior of this system. You see at the top here, it's often called the Mexican hat because it looks a bit like a sombrero. And the equilibrium point in the middle represents a high degree of symmetry. But then, according to Goldstone's theorem, there wouldn't be any mass in these interactions that we're interested in modeling. So what these physicists suggested was that we have a potential which looks like this, and which requires that the system moves from the symmetric unstable equilibrium to an unstable equilibrium at the bottom. In that way, it would be possible to produce masses in a field, which has then been baptized the Higgs field after Peter Higgs. And you see that if this ball representing the current state of the system falls from the top to the trough at the bottom, we lose symmetry. But symmetry is kept at the higher level, so to say. That is what physicists normally refer to as a hidden symmetry, because the overall setup is symmetric, very much like this pencil. This is a symmetric system. It falls like the ball in the Mexican hat to a stable state, and then symmetry is lost. But behind this is asymmetry. We don't know which of these possible states it will occupy. And as it happens, that was brought about by a loss of energy. So the original energy level decreased substantially in order for this to become possible. The common pattern then is that we have systems that are symmetric at one level, and then when the energy level drops, we lose symmetry. But the sort of the background symmetry is still there. And the sort of the motor behind this process is the lack of stability of the original equilibrium. Now let's turn to something very different, a technical system instead of, well, that's of course also a physical system, but it's one that is not natural. It was put together by two brothers, Wright brothers, and this is a photo of their first flight on the 17th of December in 1903. A little over 100 years ago. It's a fascinating story. They were not alone in their endeavor to get something into the air which was heavier than the air at the time. Their main competitor was a group headed by Samuel Pierpont Langley, who was head of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And that group had a huge budget. They eventually spent something like $70,000 on their attempt to get a machine into the air, and they failed, whereas the Wright brothers spent less than $1,000, and they were successful. So ample resources is no guarantee for success, which is one interesting lesson. But more interesting from this perspective is that the main reason why the Wright brothers were successful is that they permitted their aircraft to be unstable. A lot of attempts had been made before during the late 19th century. You may have heard the name of Otto Lilienthal in Germany, who designed something well, a glider, basically, which he tried to keep stable. Unfortunately, he was killed in an accident during one of his attempts to fly. And the Wright brothers had a very different approach to this problem. They made experiments with kites before flying, not kites of the kind that kids play with, but essentially kites designed like the wings of this aircraft, but without the fuselage. And they experimented with different curvature of the wings, with different angles between the horizontal line and the wing, and so on. And when they had designed what they thought was the perfect kite, they mounted the motor on that fuselage and they took off. So they made a correct analysis of the problem. This is not a problem of motor engineering, it's an aerodynamic problem, basically. But more specifically about instability, you can see that one of the brothers is lying flat on the aircraft. That's how they piloted this. He's lying there on his stomach. He had two spokes, one for the elevator in front, and one for the rudder at the back, there. But during their first designs, they noticed that if you try to change the course of the aircraft by moving just the rudder at the end, there, it will roll like this and it will crash. So they understood that they would have, they needed a third control mechanism in order to tilt the aircraft like birds. When birds turn, they tilt a bit like this. And so they introduced a primitive form of what's now called the aileron, skevrod in Swedish. That was controlled in a very sophisticated way, actually. The pilot was lying flat on a sort of cradle, and when he moved his left hip towards the ground, that would affect the curvature of the wing on the other side. And so they managed to change the shape of the wings in order for this roll to be inaugurated. But the critical part of it is actually the elevator. Because you see, the elevator here is at the front of the aircraft. And today, most aircraft have the elevator at the rear end of the aircraft. This is a highly unstable design. You can imagine if you raise the elevator somewhat, you will get much more lifting power, and the aircraft will tend to move very fast in that direction. And conversely, if you tilt it downwards, it will grip. Whereas if you have it at the end, which is standard these days, this reaction will be much slower. So this improvement came with the price. It was extremely stressful for the pilot to keep the aircraft at a constant altitude. Actually, you can see the first aircraft had no wheels. It was running on a sledge. So they had problems with friction against the ground. They had built something like a wooden rail here for the aircraft to take off. But if they had put this elevator at the rear end and tried to make the aircraft take off, that would actually have created increased pressure on the rear end of the aircraft, and that would have increased the friction. So it's quite possible that this design with the elevator at the front was what made this thing work, which made it possible for the Wright brothers to take off with their aircraft. Only 10 years later, around 1913, 1914, one of the leading engineers in the United States, Elmer Sperry, had designed the first autopilot, which sort of relieved the pilot of this stressful task of keeping the aircraft at a constant altitude, and realized that via a feedback mechanism. So the lesson is that instability can actually be part of the design. It can be useful in certain contexts, but you need to compensate for that instability in order to create a manageable technical system. Okay, let's turn to ecology. These two curves show the number of furs that were delivered to the Hudson Bay Company in Canada between 1845 and 1935 from two animals which were precious, the hare and the lynx. The lynx, lodjur in Swedish. And of course what's striking here is the violent oscillations. You don't spontaneously believe that these oscillations reflect some strange behavior among the trappers and hunters. If there's a certain number of hunters out there, they try to catch these animals, shoot them or trap them, and at least in the first approximation, we believe that the catch in some sense reflects the size of the population out there. So the question is, how come we have these violent oscillations? Of course, the lynx feeds on the hare, so we have a predator-prey interaction here. But spontaneously, most of us would believe that this system would converge to some stable level. A certain number of lynx per square kilometer, a certain number of hares per square kilometer, and that's it. And yet you have these violent oscillations. Incidentally, the same thing was observed in the Mediterranean, where fishermen, Italian fishermen, observed the same swings in catch. Although they made the same effort from year to year, they were rewarded very differently from one year to the next. The period here is about 10 years. There's something like 9 or 10 peaks in this 90-year period. So the period is about 10 years. And something similar was observed for the fish populations in the Mediterranean. Now, two Italian mathematicians were engaged in this problem, and they came up with a model which is now referred to as the Lotka-Volterra model, from the name of these two mathematicians. And the somewhat surprising result was that if you make some very simple assumptions about the behavior of the predator population and the prey population, you get these oscillations as an immediate result. Basically, you assume that the probability that the predator hits a prey animal is proportional to the size of the predator population and the prey population. I mean, basically the product of the densities of these two populations. That's what we would assume, at least in the first approximation. And it turns out, when you analyze this nonlinear dynamical system is that you get these oscillations more or less automatically. You don't have to assume that there is some force driving this system from outside. You get this as a direct result of your simple assumptions. Now, of course, in reality, this is much more complicated than I have described here. There may be other predators and other prey involved. For instance, you have microbes, parasites that would intervene in the mortality index of the hare population, and how fast these parasite spread would also depend on frequency. So you can make this as complicated as you like, but it illustrates in a way that with very simple assumptions you may end up with something which is unstable without assuming anything, an external driving force which sort of would generate these oscillations. So from animal populations, let's turn to human populations. This shows the gross domestic product in the United States during half a century, from 1954 to 2005. And you see this familiar phenomenon of business cycles, that the GDP varies like that from one year to the next. Actually, the period is something like 5 years, but it varies a lot, and you see this curve is more irregular than the population interactions that I showed in the previous slide. So this is all well known. Now this is something which is considered a bit awkward by most economists. You have the quotation from Milton Friedman at the bottom: "If the economy isn't stable, we are all wasting our time," which is kind of strange from a Nobel Prize laureate in economics, because we all know that the economy isn't stable. So this reflects, in a sense, the sense of awkwardness that economists, even at the highest level, experience when watching how the economy actually works. And actually, there have been lots of attempts among theoretical economists to sort of explain away these instabilities. The story of general equilibrium theory is a fairly old one. I mean, markets have existed for a very long time, and actually Muslim thinkers started to analyze the workings of markets back in the Middle Ages, long before the Western Europe had risen to its later level. Actually, Adam Smith had some of these Muslim thinkers in Latin translation in his own library. So it's quite probable that when Smith wrote his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, he had got some ideas from these Muslim thinkers 600 years earlier. And what was the puzzle to people thinking about the economy before this general equilibrium concept was accepted was why doesn't this system develop into chaos? If there is no central planning, how come we can have a functioning market for vegetables, for housing, or whatever? And there was division among economic thinkers at the time when Smith was writing. Some attempts were made in France by Turgot in the 1780s, and as you know, eventually this general equilibrium concept became widely accepted, and more or less free markets and free trade have developed since to become the norm of how we should manage the economic system. But it took quite a long time before this was approached mathematically in a satisfactory way. And actually into the 1950s, when Kenneth Arrow and Gérard Debreu managed to prove, within quotation marks, that a sort of an abstract model of producers and consumers without state intervention will find something which we could call a general equilibrium, where production meets consumption and no resources are wasted. What they proved actually was that there is an equilibrium point. They did not manage to prove that this equilibrium was stable. And that would have been quite a surprise if we look at that, because what we see here empirically is that the general equilibrium is not stable. So any attempt to prove mathematically that the equilibrium is stable appears somewhat futile. And actually, following Arrow's and Debreu's results in the 50s, there was a series of negative results coming up after starting with Scarf in 1960, and then Sonnenschein, Mantell, and Debreu came back to it in the early 1970s. And they proved that actually this equilibrium that defines sort of equality between production and consumption may be extremely weird. You can have any type of dynamics around this equilibrium. So the general message thus is that there is something like an equilibrium, but we shouldn't try to prove anything like dynamic stability of this equilibrium. And people like Friedman and others will have to swallow this message, even if it's painful. Now let's turn to something which is closer to our everyday experience. This is social security in Sweden. More precisely, the sick leave absence in Sweden from 1955 to 2013. You know, every now and then we have a very intensive debate about sick leave absence. And that happens particularly during the periods when it's rising, like it's doing now, which it did started in 1998 up to 2002, and well, somewhat less here. Strangely, these discussions tend to die out when sick leave absence moves in that direction. When you have rising absence, you have all kinds of physicians and psychologists, psychiatrists entering the debate, explaining why we are living in an ever more stressful existence, workplaces that are not well adapted to the needs of the employees, etc. But given that we have also these other periods, they would indicate, using the same arguments, that the quality of workplaces have risen drastically during those, was it 6 or 7 years before it started to rise again, and we don't hear that sort of argument. So, in summary, I guess no one seriously claims that these variations that we see here reflect something like objectively measured health among Swedish what is striking is these variations. I've estimated a polynomial curve here in the one you see in the middle here, and as you see, if you take this as an average, filtering out the oscillations, absence was at its highest during the 1980s, and it's much lower now than it was in those days. But the public debate tends to concentrate on these violent swings because it's extremely myopic in its perspective. So the question we should ask is rather, why these violent oscillations? And by now you should have the answer: this is an unstable system. Okay, that should be your reflex by now. That's how an unstable equilibrium behaves. So let's try and figure out what is behind these oscillations, because the average level is not a problem. Actually, the absentee level here is quite comparable to any other European country, the ones that we normally compare ourselves with. So let's try to come to grips with this instability. And this is my suggestion. We take a look at the interactions between the main protagonists in this drama, which is the insured person, the insured citizen, who lives in a social environment. There is the physician, who is a critical person, because you need a physician to write a diagnosis telling the National Insurance Agency that this person is entitled to Social Security because the capacity to work has been reduced by at least 25%, or 50 or 75 or whatever. And then, of course, there is another agent here, the employer. As I said, the people working in the medical profession, whether they are physicians or psychiatrists, they tend, of course, to focus on their particular expertise in this area. They talk about diagnosis, they talk about changing conditions in workplaces or in everyday life that might explain rising or falling absentee levels. If you ask an economist, he or she would spontaneously tell you that this is a question about incentives. So if the level of absenteeism is too high, you must sharpen the incentives. You should reduce remuneration levels, etc. Now, the problem with this economic explanation is that these violent swings have nothing to do with the pikes here, have nothing to do with changes in the regulatory framework. Nothing happened here in 2002. Here in 2008, we had a right-wing government which tightened the rules significantly, but then we were already on this downward slope. And in spite of these new rules, we got this new drastic behavioral change a few years later. So the economic explanation does not work. And my feeling about these explanations that focus on incentives is that they are somewhat like what English normally refer to as playing Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark on stage. So the main protagonist is missing from that explanation, and the main protagonist is, of course, the National Social Insurance Agency, because there is a considerable freedom of action in the way the Social Insurance Agency interprets the rules and decides who is entitled to Social Security or not. Now, my main point is in the heading up there. This system is dominated by positive feedback mechanisms. And to explain this in more concrete terms, an insured person lives in a social environment, and we have empirical evidence showing that if the number of people who are on sick leave in your environment increases, then the probability that you yourself will also become absent increases. So there's a positive feedback from the environment. This is a norm-setting environment in a sense. There's also positive feedback mechanism in the interaction between the insurance agency and the insured person, in the sense that, of course, if the number of applications goes up, then the number of people on leave will also rise. But it will actually rise more than proportionally, because if the pile of applications increases on the desk of the civil servant, there will be a temptation to say yes instead of no, because saying yes takes less time than saying no. So, and we have observed that as well. The tendency to accept applications increases when the inflow increases, all things equal. There is also empirical evidence that decisions by physicians, which theoretically should be governed only by professional verdicts and judgment, are influenced by the insured person. If the insured person wants a diagnosis, then that increases the likelihood of getting a yes. So the only negative feedback is actually down here. It's the employer who wants to keep the employed person in place, at least in the short time perspective. And given that positive feedback mechanisms like these tend to create instability, my suggestion is that this is the main explanation for the behavior that we observe. This, again, very different from economists or psychiatrists' analysis. And my final example is this about inequality. What you see here is a summary of human history during the latest 2,000 years. And on the horizontal axis, you have the level of economic development. It's a logarithmic scale, so the GDP level per capita increases rather fast when you move towards the right here. And on the vertical axis, you have a measure of inequality, or rather equality in society. Economists and sociologists normally use something called the Gini index, or the Gini coefficient, to measure the level of inequality. And the Gini coefficient is a number between 0 and 1, where 0 means full equality and 1 means that one person owns everything in a society. So high numbers indicate systems characterized by inequality. Now, here I have inverted this. So on the vertical axis you have 1 minus the Gini index. It implies that here the line y equals 1 represents full equality in a society, sort of a nirvana state of society for those who dream about equality. And this curve here represents something called the inequality possibility frontier. If you read literature in anthropology, anthropologists who have visited hunter-gatherer societies in southern Africa or in the Amazonas, they often come back with reports stating that these societies are highly egalitarian. The differences between the powerful, the rich, and the poor in those societies are much more limited than we observe in Western societies or even in Egypt 2,000 years ago. Now, the simple explanation for that is that as long as you live here, close to existence minimum, there is no room for inequality, because if somebody appropriates more than his or her share, someone else will die. So the basic restriction that we must keep everybody alive implies that societies which are poor have to be egalitarian for mathematical reasons. And the richer society becomes, the more room there is for political decision-making concerning the distribution of surplus. Okay? And you see here, there are a number of societies like Sweden in 1975, Sweden 2000, and an arrow indicating that during that 25-year period, GDP rose substantially, but so did inequality. And most of the arrows here point downwards, indicating that a general rise in GDP level per capita is connected to a rise in inequality. This is not a law of nature, however, because if we had had Sweden 1875 here, 100 years before, we would have had a system which was both poorer and less egalitarian. So it is possible under certain circumstances to couple a rising GDP level with increased equality. But leaving politics aside, we could ask a question: what is the explanation behind this general picture that virtually all societies in human history have been characterized by inequality? Why isn't society striving spontaneously towards full equality, sort of the horizontal line here at the top? Why is that not a stable equilibrium towards which societies gravitate? Well, there are, of course, lots of explanations put forward in the public debate about this, and also in the social sciences. The standard justification you hear in the public debate from the political right is that there are differences in income, there are differences in assets, and those are explained by differences in effort or differences in capabilities. So they are legitimate. They are sort of explained to 100% by differences in effort and capability. Now, that explains some of the differences, but it won't take us very far. You may have noticed a publication from the British organization Oxfam that comes at the beginning every year in January or February, stating that how many of the world's richest person it takes to get as much assets as the poorer half of the world's population has. The poorer half has about 3.5 billion people. Now, a couple of years ago, the number was 85. the 85 richest person in the world owned as much as the poorer half of the world's population. And last year, I believe the figure was 65 something. So there's some process of concentration going on at the top. It's obvious that you cannot explain such huge differences by referring to differences in effort and capability. It's physically impossible for somebody to be 100 million times as productive as someone else. I mean, we all have 24 hours per day to spend on work, and this poorer half of the world's population includes a lot of fairly well-educated people in middle-income countries. So we are not talking about illiterates exclusively. A second proposal you hear sometimes is violence, that inequality is explained by violence. And that again explains some of the inequalities that we have observed during human history. Obviously the process of colonization of the Americas, of Africa and parts of Asia was carried out using lots of organized violence, and that led to social structures in Latin America and elsewhere which were highly unequal. But again, that will not take us very far. Here in Sweden, for instance, inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient has risen by 50% over the last 30 years. And we haven't seen any uncontrolled violence on the part of some agent in this system that could explain that. So obviously this is not enough. Now my proposal, again, as you might guess by now, is that we are dealing with an unstable system here. And to make it very simple, think about the minimal society we could imagine consisting of two persons. Say, for instance, two farmers who are living next to one another and who need the cooperation of one another in order to produce the annual harvest and to survive until next year. Assume that they are identical. They make the same effort, they have the same preferences, and they have the same assets initially, equally rich at the start. Then we assume, as everybody does, that we have what economists call decreasing risk aversion. The richer you become, the more risks you can take. That's very basic. You can afford to wait, you can afford to risk to lose something if you have large assets, but if you live on close to the existence minimum, you must be much more careful. So this is not subject to discussion. The fourth here is more mathematical by nature. It's the Nash model of negotiation, which basically provides a mathematical instrument by which we can compute how two parties negotiating will share a pie. We need not go into the details here, but I think most people realize intuitively what's going to happen here. If we start with identical persons having identical assets and who are identical in all other respects, and they generate a pie to be shared after harvest each year, then the obvious solution is to share that equally. I mean, for symmetrical reasons, they will share equally. So the question is, assume that we disturb that equilibrium somewhat and give a little bit more assets to one of the parties. What will happen? Well, this will happen. And that comes about because of this decreasing risk aversion. If somebody gets 1% more at the start here, that will make it possible for that party to this negotiation to take a bit more risk and to be rewarded accordingly. And so you have a positive feedback mechanism, and by now you should know that that leads to instability. So there is no natural other equilibrium. You will run into the limit here, and ultimately the poorer party will die or will be kept alive at the mercy of the other party, who may be interested in keeping this workforce functional. This is, of course, highly simplified and very primitive. What is interesting is that you can reproduce exactly the same result for a full market model, which was done 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, by 2 American economists, Ricardo and Robert Fernholz. They assume, again, that we have a large society. I mean, my simple model, we had 2 persons. Here we have an infinite number of individuals who are identical in all important respects. We have an economic surplus that is generated, but this time we have a financial market to invest in. It's a growing economy, so we can invest. We don't have to consume everything in order to survive. And the risk that you take in this portfolio that you invest in is determined by current assets. And again, if we assume this standard behavior pattern that richer persons can afford to take higher risks, that will determine the long-term dynamics. And of course, we have stochastic elements. When you invest in the financial market, you don't know exactly how much you will get in return, because there is uncertainty about the behavior of this market. Now, this is the answer, what will happen in the long run. To the left, you see the Gini coefficient. So there's a number of years within quotation marks. This is, of course, a highly idealized model. And on the vertical axis, you have the Gini coefficient. And you see that the Gini coefficient rises monotonously towards 1, which implies that in the long run, one person in this society will own the total assets in this society. And the other 2 curves, they are simply, well, what you get, change some basic parameter of this equation. So they affect the speed, but not the ultimate result. To the right, we have a different measure of inequality. This shows, the green curve shows the share of total assets that the quintile between 90 and 95% own. And the red one shows how much is owned by the one between 95 and 99%. And the black curve shows how much is owned by the upper 1% in this society. And again, you see with this different measure, the ultimate result is the same, that the upper 1% in the long run will own everything. So again, we have an egalitarian equilibrium, but unfortunately this egalitarian equilibrium is unstable, and we get a symmetry breaking, very much like the Higgs model, that from perfectly symmetric starting positions for everybody, we end up in a final state which is highly unsymmetrical with respect to income and assets. So let me now try to make a dynamic summary of this. First, there is the, let's call it the ontological aspects of instability and symmetry making, namely that instabilities are of vital importance to the functioning of systems in a wide range of domains, whether we are talking about economics or medicine or physics. These instabilities occur and they are important. There is secondly a heuristic message. We should think about these instabilities because they lead us to ask different questions when facing an actual system. I mean, take the social insurance example I showed you. I mean, there's been written thousands and thousands of pages about sick leave absence and what explains it. And everybody has concentrated on some sort of stable relationship between incentives and absenteeism, or external factors. Given a certain disease spectrum in society, we get a certain level of absence. My proposal is instead, look at the behavior of the system, and that will lead you to ask a completely different question. The main problem is not the average level of absence. The main problem is these violent swings, and if you want to change the behavior, you should concentrate on what to do about those swings. The third technical or political, if you like, message is that these instabilities and symmetry breaking mechanisms create problems for us. It would be much simpler if we had gravitation to nice equilibria, or if we could fly without permitting instability in the technical system. But unfortunately, the world does not look like that, so we have to cope with these instabilities in our engineering or politician capacities, depending on where we are in society. And finally, a philosophical conclusion. On the other hand, if there were no symmetry breaking, nothing would exist at all. So the alternative is worse. Would be a bit boring if we weren't here at all to ask these interesting questions. So with this I close. Here are some suggestions for further reading if you want to dig deeper into these issues. I mean, this list could be made infinitely long. I have made reference basically to my own publications, and for nostalgic reasons also to my old professor in Lund, Carl-Johan Åström at the bottom, who still at the age of 76 produced a book about feedback systems, which I can recommend. It's a highly readable book. So thank you for your attention.